So, good evening, dear students. Welcome to Bajirao IAS Academy, the Hindu news analysis. Today is 2nd November 2024, and today we have some important articles for the discussion. And one by one, we'll try to discuss all these important articles in a very detailed manner, right? So, yesterday I've given one prelims practice question. So, the question was, which of the following articles of the Indian Constitution requires the Prime Minister of India to furnish information related to decisions of the Council of Ministers to the President of India? So I hope you have understood this question. So the question is that who is the head of the state? So the head of the state is President, and the head of the government is the Prime Minister. And in fact, the Prime Minister is the head of the Council of Ministers, right? So Prime Minister usually takes a leadership position of the entire Council of Ministers. So therefore, in fact, Prime Minister usually communicates everything to the President, right? So whatever the Council of Ministers or whatever decisions that the Council of Ministers have been taken, those decisions will be communicated to the President by the Prime Minister, right? So in fact, Indian Constitution has in fact required that the Prime Minister of India to furnish information related to decisions. So the Council of Ministers and the Prime Minister, President, right? So Council of Ministers is executive. So in fact, President is also part of the Union Executive. So Council of Ministers takes key decisions. They take important decisions on different policy matters. So whatever decisions that the Council of Ministers have been taken, those decisions will be communicated to the President by the Prime Minister. And in fact, one article of the Indian Constitution has provided for the same. And the question is, what is that article? The correct answer for this question is option C, Article 78. So you need to remember this. And in fact, Article 75 provided for the Council of Ministers headed by the Prime Minister. So Article 78 talks about the Prime Minister of India furnish information related to the decisions taken by the Council of Ministers. And if you look into the explanation part of this question, as I have told you that the correct answer is Article 78 of the Indian Constitution. And in fact, as per Article 78 of the Indian Constitution, it shall be the duty or it shall be the responsibility of the Prime Minister of India to communicate to the President all decisions that the Council of Ministers have been taken relating to the administration of the affairs of the Union and even proposals for the legislation. Now secondly, to furnish such information, so that information is relating to the administration of the affairs of the Union and proposals for legislation as a President may call for. Thirdly, so if the President requires to submit for the consideration of Council of Ministers and any matter on which decision has been taken by Minister but which has not been considered by the Council of Ministers. So Article 78 of Indian Constitution provides that these three things will be the duty or the responsibility of the Prime Minister, right? So I would again like to explain you the third duty of the Prime Minister. For example, if President requires some information, so some details with respect to a certain policy or certain legislation, to submit for the consideration of the Council of Ministers. So any matter on which a decision has been taken by a minister but which has not been considered by the Council, right? So these are the duties and the responsibilities of the Prime Minister. And today also we have another very important prelims practice question, and this question was asked by UPSC in 2021 prelims examination. The question is, during Indian freedom struggle, which of the following was known as the Red Fort trials? So the options are A, Chauri Chaura incident trial, option B, the Rowlatt Act trial, and option C, Komagata Maru incident trial, and option D, Indian National Army trial. So this is very important, and this question is from the modern Indian history, and if you have at least gone through modern Indian history, you can clearly answer this question, because Red Fort trials are very famous in the modern Indian history, especially 1940s it happened. Right, so try to answer this question in the comment section, and I'll be providing you the correct answer in the next class. And without any delay, let's get into the discussion. Let's discuss all these important articles one by one. So the first article that we are going to start this discussion is with zeroing in on methane diplomacy at COP29. Now, what is COP29? You may have get this doubt. So COP is a conference of parties. Right, so we have a convention, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, why this convention is being established or being formed, and what is the objective that this particular convention came into force? So the main responsibility or main objective of this convention is to limit global warming, and also control or mitigate the negative impact of the climate change. So we all knew that now climate change is a new reality, and climate change has been altering the existing climate conditions or climate patterns, and because of climate change we have been experiencing extreme weather events such as droughts, cyclones, floods, and more of those events we have been regularly experiencing, because recent example of landslides in Wayanad and floods in Wayanad in Kerala, that was also because of climate change. Right, so increasing intensity and frequency of cyclones, it is also because of the climate change. And one thing that you need to understand when we are talking about the impact of climate change on different countries, so there is a huge difference in terms of impact of climate change on different countries across the world, because the global north, that is comparatively developed region of the world. So in fact, the impact or the vulnerability of the global north would be lesser compared to the global south, because global south is not a developed region, it is a developing and underdeveloping region. So still the global south has been facing a lot of problems such as refugee crisis, population density, higher levels of poverty, malnutrition, illiteracy, and lower levels of infrastructure and unstable governments. So all these problems that the global south has been facing. Now in this context, as we have understood that the impact of climate change and the vulnerability of climate change is not same across all regions or all parts of the world. So however, it is very important that the world should come forward and the world needs to act collectively on this climate change, and because of that reason this United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change came into force, or it was formed. And in fact, conference of parties is all the member countries which are signatory to this particular convention are known as the conference of parties. Right, so this 29th meeting of United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is going to be held in Azerbaijan capital Baku. Right, so Baku is going to host the 29th conference of parties of United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Right, so I hope you have understood this. It is very simple. And in fact, this 29th conference of parties is also called as the finance conference of parties, because through this conference of parties, so various new mechanisms would be discussed and deliberated upon, and those mechanisms essentially aimed at financing the climate change initiatives, climate change reduction initiatives, mitigation initiatives, and adaptation initiatives. And because of that reason, it is also dubbed as Finance Corp. Now, one thing that I would like to tell you is that I've told you that the vulnerability and the impact of climate change is not same across all different parts of the world. And in fact, the developing world has been facing the worst impact of the climate change. However, in order to deal with the climate change and its negative impact, the developing world requires finance and technology transfer. So in order to ensure that the developed world provide finances to the developing world to ensure that they can effectively deal with the negative impacts of climate change, it is very important that a finance needs to be provided to the developing world. And because of that reason, this 29th Conference of Parties is also called as Finance Conference of Parties. And in fact, the representatives from all the countries which are signatories to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, they are going to, for the first time in 15 years, they are going to set a new global climate finance goal. Right, so there will be a new global climate finance goal, and this new global climate finance goal is also known as New Collective Quantified Goal, or NCQG. Okay, so this is called as Finance Conference of Parties, and all signatory countries to the UNFCCC will sit together, and they will, for the first time in 15 years, will set a new global climate finance goal, and it is also known as New Collective Quantified Goal. And in fact, as I have told you, that the host country is Azerbaijan. So Azerbaijan is going to host this 29th Conference of Parties, and in fact Azerbaijan has also put forward an action agenda. Right, so as part of the action agenda of Azerbaijan, it has put forward 3 important goals. Now what are those 3 important goals that are put forward by Azerbaijan? So one goal is that all the countries should commit themselves to increase battery storage capacity. Right, so this is the first pledge, battery storage capacity. Now I hope you have understood why it is important to enhance the battery storage capacity, because in recent times electric vehicles have got a significant limelight, and they are very important to deal with the global warming and climate change, because the diesel and petrol vehicles release emissions, the carbon emissions, and carbon emissions are primarily responsible for the global warming. Right, so second thing that the Azerbaijan has put forward as part of its action agenda is to dramatically expand electricity networks. Right, so dramatically expand electricity networks, and this is going to be the third goal, which is part of action agenda of Azerbaijan. And thirdly, cut methane emissions. Right, so cutting down methane emissions from organic waste. Now why methane emissions? Why specifically methane emissions? So I hope you knew that methane is a potential greenhouse gas, and in fact a lot of countries, both developed and developing countries, have been releasing enormous amounts of methane into the atmosphere. Since it is a potential greenhouse gas, it has been contributing to the global warming. Right, so global warming further leads to climate change. Right, so global warming further contributing to the climate change. Now what are the potential sources of methane? So that is what we should also understand. Now when we look into the potential sources of methane, agriculture is one of the key source of methane. Apart from agriculture, vehicular emissions also the potential source of emission, industrial emissions as well, and burning organic waste. So all these things are the major sources of methane. So therefore it is very important that we need to cut down the global methane emissions if we are committed to reduce global warming or control global warming. And some data with respect to methane is that methane's climate impacts are very severe, because methane alone accounting for around 30% of the global warming across the world. And in fact, methane is also 28% or 28 times more potent than the carbon dioxide. Now, we all knew that the carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, but methane is more potent, right? So methane is more potent because methane has 28 times greater global warming potential. So by this you have understood so how methane poses significant threat to the global climate. And in fact, so when we specifically look into India and its India's data or India's record in terms of emitting or contributing to methane to the global atmosphere, so India is world's third largest methane emitter, right? So the first largest methane emitter is China, followed by US and then India, right? So understand one thing, that India is the third largest source of anthropogenic methane emissions. And in fact, earlier, US and China, two biggest emitters of methane, so they come together. They decided to cut the emissions that they have been releasing into the atmosphere, because methane is a greenhouse gas, and apart from greenhouse gas, its potential is 28 times more than the carbon dioxide, and because of that reason both US and China decided to cut down the methane emissions. So therefore, this is going to be a good opportunity for India to leverage US-China methane partnership to gain sector-specific financing as well as capacity building support. Now, India is a developing country. So India is a developing country. So if India wanted to cut down its methane emissions, India requires a lot of finances, because we need to look for alternatives to methane. And alternatives to methane, so for that to happen we need research and development, and we need the necessary infrastructure, right? So we should also invest a lot in new technologies, and because of that reason, so we need a lot of finances. So this US and China partnership with respect to reducing methane can be effectively used by India to gain sector specific financing as well as the capacity building support. Now in this context, so but when we talk about India's overall contribution to methane, so as we have just discussed that India is the third largest emitter of methane, but in India, agriculture sector is a dominant sector which has been contributing to more than 60% of the methane emissions. Okay, so particularly livestock and rice cultivation has been a primary factor which has been contributing to the significantly higher levels of emissions. And in fact, this is what makes India hesitant to announce the economy-wide methane reduction targets, right? So methane reduction targets for India means that India needs to impose certain restrictions on cultivation of rice and even the livestock rearing. And as we knew that most of the people, around 50% of the people, directly or indirectly engaged in agriculture sector, and most of the people who are poor, they are also engaged with the agriculture sector. So because of the significance of agriculture and the primary sector of the economy, India as of now reluctant to impose any restrictions on the livestock and the other sectors which have been contributing to the significantly higher proportion of methane emissions. And in fact, India was also not ready to sign the global methane pledge. So global methane pledge essentially aimed at reducing methane emissions. So whichever country is part of the global methane pledge, they should reduce the methane emissions. And India is not part of the global methane pledge because India is sensitive towards its agriculture sector, its primary sector of the economy. And in fact, the global methane pledge is championed by the US and the European Union at the previous COP28 summit, right? And which seeks to cut emissions by 30% from 2020 levels by 2030. So that is what global methane pledge. So remember that global methane pledge is very, very important from your exam perspective. So therefore, it is very important that you just go through the details of global methane pledge. Now, global methane pledge, I would like to say one thing, that global methane pledge objective is to cut down methane emissions. Cut down methane emissions. Right, so cut down methane emissions. Now, why we need to cut down methane emissions? It is because, so it is because it is a greenhouse gas, and its potential, it is a potential greenhouse gas, and it is 28 times more potent than another greenhouse gas, which is carbon dioxide. Okay, now, so we'll look into the certain waste management programs of India. So those through these waste management programs, we can cut down our methane emissions, right? So apart from focusing on agriculture sector, so methane emissions, so a significantly higher amount of methane is also generated from the waste, particularly the organic waste. So when we have the waste management programs, they will help reduce or cut down methane, right? So Indian government has developed a strong regulatory frameworks for waste management, but the problem with the government of India's regulatory framework is a weak local capacity that has been hampering its implementation. And secondly, the government has launched various programs. So one such program which is part of it is waste to energy. Waste to energy. This is also known as the Gobardhan program, right? So waste would be converted into energy source, right? So the energy will be used. So the government has been promoting galvanizing organic bioagro resources Dhan scheme, which is also known as Gobardhan scheme. So this Gobardhan scheme incentivizes the cattle waste utilization as well as the clean energy production in villages, right? So that's how people's dependence on the LPG cylinders can be reduced, because we have been importing a lot of LPG gas into India, right? So that helps reducing our import dependency on the natural gas when we have such programs which actually convert waste into energy, and that also substantially reduce the methane emissions as well. And we also know that the government has launched the Swachh Bharat Mission Urban 2.0, and this Gobardhan is part of Swachh Bharat Mission 2.0 program, particularly to improve the solid waste management. So however, cities need more support, financial support, technological support, research support. So they need more support from the central government and even the respective state governments to scale up organic waste management to its full potential. And in fact, so when we talk about the agriculture sector, which is the key emitter of the greenhouse gases, in agriculture sector also the government has implemented many schemes, right? So those schemes are being launched, started by the union government with the aim of achieving climate resilience within the agriculture. So one such program is National Mission on Sustainable Agriculture to achieve climate resilience. Achieving climate resilience is the objective of this particular program. And in fact, these include methane reduction techniques in rice cultivation, so that can substantially contribute to reducing methane emissions, because as I have told you that methane is a greenhouse gas, it is a potential greenhouse gas. Its potency is more than 28 times of carbon dioxide, and because of agriculture sector is a very important sector for India. Government of India is not part of global methane pledge. Global methane pledge. And in fact, the government has also launched the National Livestock Mission. And this livestock mission also promotes practices such as green fodder production, silage making, chaff cutting, and also total mixing of ration to reduce methane emissions from the livestock. Remember that both livestock plus agriculture are two major sectors which have been substantially contributing to the emissions of methane. And methane is a greenhouse gas, so therefore we need to focus on livestock, we need to focus on agriculture sector, we should also focus on waste management, right? So when we talk about waste management, so sustainable waste management is very important, right? So the government has launched various programs. For example, when we talk about livestock, National Livestock Mission has been launched, National Mission on Sustainable Agriculture has been launched, and even Gobardhan program has been launched, right? So in order to reduce the methane emissions. So I hope you have understood this. And this COP29 summit is going to have a credible mechanisms of finance, particularly for the developing countries, to achieve climate mitigation as well as climate mitigation and adaptation, right? So that's all about this particular article. So the next very important article is about the invisible sanitation worker, right? So we'll understand what it actually means when the article suggests an invisible sanitation worker. Now, first and foremost, the sanitation is very, very important for health, human health. I would say sanitation is very important for human health, right? So however, we have launched Swachh Bharat Abhiyan. Swachh Bharat Abhiyan has been launched to make sanitation or Swachhata a Jan Andolan, right? To make it a Jan Andolan, so thereby improving standard of living, reduce contagious diseases, and also protect dignity of individuals. So when I say dignity of individuals, that include the dignity of women as well as the dignity of the sanitation workers, right? Dignity of sanitation workers. However, so despite being this Swachh Bharat mission that was launched, so sanitation workers still live in conditions, right? So these sanitation workers are still living in conditions. So those conditions, we cannot call them a dignified life, right? So dignified life. So they are still working as the sanitation workers in inhuman conditions. Now, what are the shortcomings and what are the loopholes that are still existing? Because despite such a scheme is being launched in the year 2015, these sanitation workers still facing many problems. The living standards, the living conditions have not been improved. So we are going to discuss about that. So the Swachh Bharat mission has completed 10 years last month, right? So it's been 10 years since this Swachh Bharat mission has been launched by the union government. And in fact, so the Swachh Bharat mission has been launched in both urban and rural areas. So despite being this Swachh Bharat mission has been launched to maintain cleanliness, to ensure sanitation in both rural and urban spaces. So one single rain, a heavy rain, an intense rainfall in whether it is in rural area or urban area. So that heavy rainfall or any other intense rainfall, that immediately exposes inadequate state of sanitation despite being the Swachh Bharat mission, and inadequate state of not just sanitation including sewage and even drainage in India cities and towns. And that is the result of Chennai floods, Bengaluru floods, Hyderabad floods, Delhi floods, right? So that means the sanitation or the Swachh Bharat mission is not implemented in a foolproof manner. And in fact, throughout different parts of our country, toilets are poorly constructed as part of this Swachh Bharat mission. And very often we experience the septic tanks and drains get choked or they even overflow. And in fact, when these drains choke and they become overflow, these drains are very often the the breeding grounds for diseases, and that further exacerbate the risk which are being faced by the poor residents, migrants, and even sanitation workers. So these category of people are more vulnerable, right? So they are more vulnerable to the risks associated with the sanitation. Now we'll try to discuss about sanitation in a very detailed manner. So sanitation is a basic human right, and in fact sanitation is also a public good, and sanitation without any doubt is a critical and a very important for health and productivity of individuals. So therefore we can say without any doubt that sanitation is a human right. And in fact, sanitation is also part of the sustainable development goals. And the other thing that we need to understand is that sanitation is the most off-track sustainable development goals. That means it is not adequately focused sustainable development goals. Because as of now, despite being these sustainable development goals were launched in 2015, more than 43% of the world's population has been lacking safe sanitation. They lack access to safe sanitation. 43% of the global population. Right, so because of that reason, we can say that this is most off-track sustainable development goals. And in fact, India is a developing country, and along with India, many other countries which are part of the global south have centralized and capital incentive sanitation and waste management systems. And these centralized and capital intensive sanitation and waste management systems are mostly located or mostly confined to the large and mega cities. And we don't find these centralized and capital intensive sanitation management systems in semi-urban, small towns, and even rural areas. So that is also a cause of concern. And in fact, this makes a sanitation and waste management in urban areas is one of most compelling challenges for India. Right? So because we do not have adequate infrastructure, so we do not have the technology, we do not have the finances to safely manage the waste and also maintain cleanliness and sanitation. So because of that reason, it is one of most compelling challenges for India. And apart from that, when we talk about the financial allocations for the sanitation, hygiene, cleanliness, drinking water, and for all these purposes, in the year 2024-25 budget, drinking water and sanitation combined received rupees 77,390 crore rupees. And it is just a meager increase of only 0.5% from 23-24, a just minute increase. Okay, and until 2014, India had the world's highest prevalence of open defecation, but thanks to Swachh Bharat mission, because of that reason, uh, the number of individuals who defecate openly, the open defecation has reduced enormously. But before 2014, so around 600 million people defecating outdoors, right? So in unplanned and growing towns and even localities which are being occupied by the migrants, Dalits and other socially marginalized groups, they routinely encounter poorly managed sewage networks, blocked toilets and even open drains. And remember that I have told you that these are a vulnerable group of people, so they face high risk of contagious diseases and sanitation related illness as well, because they very often live in crowded conditions. But through Swachh Bharat mission, there are some efforts to maintain sanitation and hygiene, right? So maintain sanitation and hygiene on a large scale. And in fact, there is also data from 2018 to 2023. So this data has revealed that around 400 people died while cleaning septic tanks and also sewers, yet the authorities are routinely deny the existence of manual scavengers and informal sanitation workers. Now, one thing that you need to remember, that there was a law that was passed way back in the year 2013. Okay, so what was that law? The law was Prohibition of Employment of Manual Scavengers and Their Rehabilitation Act 2013. Okay, so this particular legislation prohibited manual scavenging. So despite this manual scavenging is prohibited, 400 people died while cleaning septic tanks and sewers. So you can imagine the unhappy state of affairs when it comes to the rehabilitation of the manual scavengers. And in fact, the current budget does not have any provisions to rehabilitate manual scavengers or sanitation workers. And in fact, the 2013 legislation clearly mandates rehabilitation of the manual scavengers along with prohibition of employment in manual scavenging. But the current budget does not have any provisions to rehabilitate the manual scavengers or sanitation workers. So when there were no efforts to skill and then rehabilitate these manual scavengers, so they may not be able to get the alternative employment opportunities, and then again they will be part of the manual scavenging, and these deaths would continue to take place, and it is also violation of human dignity, right? So violation of human dignity. So please mention in the comment section, so human dignity is part of which of the fundamental rights, right? So human dignity is part of which fundamental right? So just mention this in the comment section. And in 2022, in order to improve the living standards, in order to rehabilitate, in order to skill these manual scavengers and sanitation workers, the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment has launched Namaste scheme. So please remember this Namaste scheme. Union Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment has launched this Namaste scheme for the purpose of rehabilitation, as well as a skilling of the sanitation and manual scavengers, right? So the emphasis is on providing safety as well as skill training to the workers. However, there are a lot of challenges that these manual scavengers and sanitation workers have been facing, and these challenges can be an opportunity to reimagine off-grid urban areas for decentralized innovations that are people-centered, sustainable, equitable, and they also contribute to economic growth. And in fact, we also knew that fecal sludge is very rich in organic compounds, and it can be used in a circular economy, it can be used in agriculture, and it also has a lot of benefits, right? So a circular economy approach of resource recovery and reuse holds the promise of converting the sludge into biogas or even into fertilizer, and it is also known as the brown gold. Right, so I hope you have understood about this particular article. And the next article that we are going to discuss is that recently US imposed sanctions on 19 Indian companies because those companies have been trading with Russia, or those companies have been supplying critical technologies, critical equipment to Russia that US considers it is illegal. And because of that reason, US imposes sanctions on 19 Indian companies. So we'll understand what are these economic sanctions. The context is that United States on Wednesday, October 30, has imposed sanctions on 400 entities and individuals, including 19 Indian firms and 2 Indian nationals, for helping Russia's war efforts in Ukraine. And because of that reason, US has imposed economic sanctions on 19 Indian companies and 2 Indian nationals. And what are economic sanctions? We'll try to understand what are economic sanctions. So sanctions are basically restrict or even entirely scrap the economic relations between the entity applying the sanctions and the one they are being applied on. Right? So this is the basic definition of economic sanctions. Right? So, for example, imagine that US and there's a company A which is based in India. Right? So India based company A and US. So sanctions basically restrict or entirely scrap the economic relations between this entity A and US. Right? So there will be no economic relations between US and company A. So that is known as sanctions. And in fact, these sanctions can take the form of export or import ban. For example, US would completely ban the import of items or goods from company A. Or US will never export goods to company A in India. And even US would also refuse to trade with the company which is part of the sanction list. And US would also freeze the assets of a company. For example, imagine that in case company A has assets in US will freeze the assets of company A. And in fact, US will also prevent the company A using its banking systems and currency of a country or group of countries. So that's how sanctions are being worked. And in fact, dollar has been enjoying global hegemony. Right, so US dollar as a currency has been enjoying the global hegemony, and because of that reason, US is very often imposing sanctions on other countries and entities which trade against US interests. And apart from that, US is also a global superpower. And in fact, according to Council of Foreign Relations, these sanctions may be comprehensive. They prohibit commercial activity with regard to an entire country, like long-standing US embargo on Cuba is one example. And in fact, they may be targeted by blocking transactions by and with a particular businesses, groups or individuals. So these are some of the definitions and the explanation of the economic sanctions. So for example, US previously has imposed sanctions on number of countries. Example, Iran, North Korea, Russia, and even China also. And when the Ukraine war started, and Russia has become the most sanctioned country in the world, because most of the countries and most of the blocs, economic blocs, have imposed sanctions on Russia. So apart from individual countries, and in fact United Nations organizations can also impose economic sanctions, not just US, India, China, Russia. So in fact, UN organization can also impose economic sanctions on other countries after they are being approved by the United Nations Security Council. Now apart from UNO, individual countries and even European Union, a supranational organization too has the mechanism of imposing sanctions. It can also impose sanctions. And today we have one important mains practice question. So this is based on a news article and on judicial vacancies and judicial pendency of cases. right? So judicial vacancy is one of the problem, because justice delayed is justice denied, and there's a lot of pendency of the cases as well. The question is, there are several vacancies in the Indian judiciary at various levels: a Supreme Court, High Court, district courts, and even subordinate courts. And there aren't enough judges to hear and even decide cases, which further leads to delays and a rise of number of pending cases. So judicial vacancies and pending number of cases. So that is what we need to discuss. For any question, approach is very important. When you look into the approach, first and foremost, you just write some data about the judicial vacancies and pendency of cases. That would be enough, very brief. And then you need to briefly discuss the reasons for the pendency of the cases and the judicial vacancies, and then you need to suggest measures to address both these problems or the challenges, and ultimately you need to conclude the answer. And as I have already told you, you just mention some data about the judicial pendency as well as vacancy. So according to an answer in the Rajya Sabha on August 4, 2022, the Supreme Court has 3 seats vacant out of 34, and High Courts have 380 seats vacant out of 1,108 sanctioned number of seats. And district and subordinate courts have the vacancy of around 5,342 vacant seats out of 24,631 sanctioned seats. And apart from these vacancies, we need to talk about the data on the pendency of the cases. As of now, across 3 different the Supreme Court, High Court, and even district subordinate courts, around 4.1 crore pending cases, right? So around 4.1 crore cases are pending across Supreme Court, High Court, district courts, and subordinate courts. Now, what are the primary causes of the pendency of the cases? So there are certain causes for the pendency of the cases. So the first reason for the pendency of the cases is low judge to population ratio in India, right? So in fact, Law Commission has recommended that 50 judges must be there per 1 million population, but as of now we just have 21 judges for 1 million population. So we have low judge to population ratio with only 21 judges per million people as of 2024. So this is far lower and far below than 50 judge per 1 million population as recommended by the Law Commission. And there are also delays in filling judicial vacancies, and that further leads to understaffed courts with 30% vacancies in High Courts, adding pressure to the existing judges. And apart from that, there is a lack of infrastructure across various courts, and records are not digitalized or computerized, so this further adds to the problem. And in fact, so judges often handle multiple courts or specialized responsibilities, so that further leads to the distracting them from the ability to focus on primary cases, and it would further adds to the delay of the cases. And in fact, courts may also burdened by the number of cases, different categories of cases, for example civil cases, criminal cases, constitutional cases, appeals of many which end up in higher courts, and this also leads to the backlog of cases. However, from 1950 to 1921, so 1950 to 2021, so the number of Supreme Court judges has increased nearly 4 times. Even then, the case pendency has steadily kept rising. So there are a number of reasons, because Supreme Court has been primarily hearing appeals from high courts and other lower courts, and government litigation is also another major problem. Government litigation and the public interest litigation is being filed, right? So apart from public interest litigation, there are certain constitutional cases as well, constitutional cases. So because of all these cases, there has been increased pendency of cases from the Supreme Court's perspective, right? So there are a certain key reason. The key reason for increasing or pending number of cases can be attributed to shifting the role of Supreme Court from adjudicating cases of constitutional significance into a regular court of appeal. The Supreme Court has become, the Supreme Court has been deciding the constitutional cases. Supreme Court has been deciding appeals from the lower courts, and increased government litigation along with the public interest litigation. So all these factors have been contributing to the pendency of the cases, right? So in recent times, a frivolous public interest litigations are also being filed, and in fact various government policies which are being challenged by the people, that takes up most of the judiciary's time, right? So these are all factors which are responsible for the pendency of the cases as well as judicial vacancies. You need to suggest some measures to address the judicial vacancies as well as pending cases. So when we talk about the measures to address judicial vacancies and pending cases, state should provide suitable land for construction of court buildings, and it should undertake vertical construction in light of shortage of land, right? So that essentially means that there should be proper infrastructure in these court buildings and digitization of computer records. And apart from digitization, so we should also talk about the digitization and computerization of these court records. So it is also very, very important, so dispose of these cases and even regularly track case progress and prioritize cases. So in order to do that, technology can be leveraged, and digitization and computerization of records will certainly help. And apart from that, timelines set out for computerization of all the courts as necessary step towards setting up e-courts. And apart from e-courts, video conferencing, so the technology can be leveraged. And apart from those measures, Supreme Courts and High Courts should appoint efficient and experienced judges as ad hoc judges in accordance with the Constitution. So that will these ad hoc judges will help judiciary dispose of cases and will also meet the challenge of vacant seats within the judiciary. And All India Judicial Service. So this All India Judicial Service would benefit the subordinate judiciary by increasing the quality of judges, and that would also help reduce the pendency of the cases. So in fact, All India Judicial Service, as of now we don't have such a service. Rather there are there are a lot of demands to bring in All India Judicial Service, to bring in quality or increase quality of judges and also help reduce pendency. The use of technology for tracking and monitoring cases and even providing relevant information to make justice litigant friendly. The Lok Adalat should be organized regularly for settling civil and criminal matters, or settling civil and criminal matters. Gram Nyayalayas as an effective way to manage small claim disputes for rural areas, which will further help decreasing the workload of the judicial institutions. And Gram Nyayalayas, Lok Adalats, alternative dispute resolution methods have to be promoted. ADR needs to be promoted. So these measures would substantially help reduce the pendency of the cases, and it could also help in meeting the challenge of judicial vacancies. And apart from that, there is a method which could reduce the friction between the executive and judiciary when it comes to the judicial appointments, and all these measures have to be undertaken. And that's all in this lecture, and thank you so much. So if you like our work, please subscribe our YouTube channel and also hit the like button. Thank you.